اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. So inshallah, in this next short session, what I would like to try to do is to look briefly at three examples that are essentially somewhat like case studies. All of them come, we can share it inshallah after, with articles that should ideally be read and reflected upon. But because of the time and not having significant amounts to complete them in totality, inshallah I will just comment about them one after the other. So the first one that is important, I think, to comment on is about Edward Bernays. So Edward Bernays is called the original influencer. And here is an article that was written in February of 2019. And the article actually was, it was published, I guess, 2019, but it was first appeared years earlier at History in an issue of History Today with the title The Great Manipulator. And so it goes as follows. I'll read a few excerpts. Edward L. Bernays is regarded as one of the fathers of public relations. Although he died more than 2 decades ago, his influence pervades modern Western consumer culture. So then there's a quote. It says, "Group of girls puff at cigarettes as a gesture of freedom," read the front page of the New York Times on April 1st, 1929. It was no April's Fool joke. Rather, this spectacle of liberated smoking women was one of Bernays' most celebrated publicity stunts. Bernays' client, George W. Hill, president of the American Tobacco Company, had asked him, "How can we get women to smoke on the street? They're smoking indoors, but," and he says if they spend half the time outdoors and we can't get them to smoke outdoors, we'll near double, if we could do that, our female market. Do something, act." Bernays began to ponder how best to employ the theories which had already proven so effective in his public relations campaigns. Gustave Le Bon's Principles of Mass Psychology, Wilfred Trotter's Herd Instinct thesis, and above all, the hidden drives of human beings that Sigmund Freud, Bernays' uncle, in Vienna spoke about. Bernays needed advice and consulted the psychiatrist A.A. Brill, who had been one of Freud's pupils. What he asked Brill is the psychology basis for a woman's desire to smoke. "Cigarettes, which are equated with men," came the reply, "become torches of freedom." That's what Bernays' inspiration was. That was his campaign, to get young feminists to light up cigarettes, torches of freedom, in public as an act of emancipation, of freedom, during New York's Easter parade. This, he believed, would make its way into the nation's newspapers. Before that, however, he still needed to take care of a crucial issue, to give instruction to Bertha Hunt. She was Bernays' secretary, but at his behest, she was to forget that for a few days. She had to pass herself off as a women's rights activist and drum up comrades in arms for the Feminist Torches of Freedom campaign. No inference to American tobacco was to be permitted. In the interest of equality of the sexes and the fight against sex taboo, I and other young women will light another torch of freedom by smoking cigarettes while strolling on Fifth Avenue. Easter Sunday. These were the first lines of the telegram signed by Bertha Hunt. March 31st, 1929 was the day Bernays had set aside for his campaign. He himself was not in attendance, but would later be informed of how a group of 10 young women, walking up and down Fifth Avenue, contentedly lit up cigarette after cigarette, while Bertha Hunt fulfilled her role professionally as the purported initiator of the campaign. When a reporter from the New York World approached Hunt to ask how she had arrived at the idea of a woman's smoking march, she answered that she got the idea for the campaign when a man with her in the street asked her to extinguish her cigarette as it embarrassed him. I talked it over with my friends, and we decided it was high time something was done about the situation. In the coverage of New York's Easter Parade, scores of U.S. newspapers reported the story of the young women and their torches of freedom. While some correctly suspected a publicity stunt or stated that the smokers had not attracted much attention, others presented it as a campaign of emancipated women. Neither Bernays nor American Tobacco were ever mentioned by name in the press reports. Their camouflage remained intact. So here's an example of, from the beginnings of the promotion of public relations and its use of an individual essentially hired to help get women to smoke in public, right? And for a moment here, I don't think it's possible to properly fathom the amount of sin that this act produced. I really don't. In terms of, for example, making it to a certain extent more acceptable, and there were already problems before, but for women to smoke in public to become more acceptable of that horrific act of smoking. If one gathers in one's heart the reality of smoking, men or women, and what it means in terms of, for example, the costs financially to healthcare, the costs that take place with respect to general productivity, the wasted funds that happen through purchasing of cigarettes as opposed to other things that families and people in need. If one takes into account the effect of cancer and the rate of cancer that skyrocketed after the widespread use of cigarettes, and what it means at the level of, for example, people dying, parents dying, fathers dying, children dying, young people dying, and what it means continuously up until this day that someone made easy that notion and made glamorous that notion of poisoning oneself with a cigarette. I had the statistics, but I don't have them with me, about even in Turkey. What they say is that I think something along the lines of 10% of children under 13 smoke. What it says to the cost at the level of the cost on healthcare, and what it means for the suffering of people all over the world, and what it means even at so many different levels. The idea of crops and growing tobacco and what that means, and unfair practices, etc., exploitation, but just in terms of harm and hurt. And here we have an example of someone generating a campaign, the likes of which is completely fabricated for the sole purpose of pushing forth such a horrific behavior. And so it says in the article, he bolstered the new profession with theory, gave it a philosophical framework, and processed the findings of the blossoming psychological disciplines by coming up with new methods of manipulating the public. Harold Burson, CEO of Burson Marsteller, one of the world's largest PR companies, was quoted in the 1990s as saying, "We're still singing off the hymn book that Bernays gave us." Influenced by his famous uncle with whom he corresponded regularly, which is Sigmund Freud, Bernays got to understand the power of the unconscious, universal longings of emotion and of instinct. He exploited them for whatever he had to sell: artificial flowers, racehorses, gramophones, politicians, ideologies, no matter what it was. He often worked according to a certain dramaturgy, which his biography Larry Tye described thus: he generates events, and events generate news, and the news generates a demand for whatever he is happening to be selling. In Bernays' eyes, generating events was one, or if not the most important task of a PR advisor. He labeled it as the creation of circumstance, the staging of apparently spontaneous events to influence people's behavior according to the wishes of his clients. This was genuinely innovative because until then, business advertising was relatively straightforward, extolling the product and its functional advantage. Bernays, by contrast, aimed at the unconscious and trusted in the indirect method. It's like shooting billiards, he once pointed out. You bounce the balls off cushions, as opposed to pool where you aim directly for the pockets. So it says, and this article continues about his tactics and how he behaved and how he worked in the field. And it states, for example, that he began to field front groups, in quotes. That is, seemingly independent organizations which profess to support concerns of the common good. The Committee Institute for the Audible Arts, the Temperature Research Foundation, the Middle American Information Bureau, all seemingly innocuous actions that were in reality set up by Bernays solely for PR purposes. So here he ends up fabricating institutions, generating, other companies and other organizations to put forward his really horrific views of essentially the mandates that he had in terms of selling. And this has by no means ended. The article continues. There were years of the birth. These were the years of birth of modern political PR. Bernays' methodologies would soon be part of its stock equipment and inspire future generations, resulting in the events of a campaign which went down as a dark chapter in the more recent history of the industry. In October 1990, on Capitol Hill, a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl named Nayara stated in a public hearing of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus that while volunteering in a Kuwaiti hospital, she saw Iraqi soldiers take babies out of their incubators, leaving them on the cold floor to die. More than 700 stations broadcasted the appearance of Nurse Nayara, which shocked the U.S. public and finally convinced it to take military action against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So here we have a political, a PR move of this young woman talking about those incubators, and it's incredible how deeply that spread. I remember this because at that time, I think I was in grade 8 in Canada, and I remember when the Gulf War happened, I went to drama class. And the teacher in my drama class, mashallah, at that time, out of her kindness, she wanted to have a discussion about the war. And why was it so, and its effect on the students and their feelings of anxiety, etc. And I remember one girl in particular, the exact thing that she said was that he's taking babies out of incubators. And I remember that from that class. And so 3 months later, Operation Desert Storm begins. There was only one problem. The incubator story was not true, and the 15-year-old nurse turned out to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the US. This, however, did not come out until after the war was over, when in January 1992, it became known that the New York public relations firm Hill and Knowlton was behind the story. Hill and Knowlton's client was the front group, was called the Citizens for a Free Kuwait, an organization that was funded by the Kuwaiti government in exile. It wanted to convince the US public to strike against Iraq and did so. This was what was meant by the engineering of consent, which was a term that Bernays coined and pushed. And so here we have the real deep implications of propaganda, and how through a seemingly single PR stunt, you can turn the tide through that of a whole country to invade another country, to wage war upon another country, to decimate another country. PR and manipulation is something that we have to be definitively more cognizant of and aware of in our lives. The second case study, and I won't go through this one in depth, but just to leave you with a thought, and that is it's the erasure of Islam from the poetry of Rumi. So as many of you know, Rumi as a poet, rahimahullah, Maulana Rumi, he has a really wide purchase across the whole of the Muslim world, but also particular in the West. And Maulana Rumi was a scholar of Sharia first and foremost. And there's some beautiful texts that state his adherence to the Sunnah, and that how he says that if there is anything that is interpreted of him that is against the Quran and the Sunnah, he rejects it. And what happens is that there becomes, several characters in the West that start to translate the works of Rumi, Maulana Rumi, into English. And they range the gambit of being complete fabrications. For example, Chopra, an author of Deepak Chopra, an author of spiritual works and an alternative medicine enthusiast, admits that his poems are not Rumi's words. Rather, he writes in the introduction to the love poems of Rumi, they are moods we have captured as certain phrases radiated from the original Farsi, giving life to a new creation but retaining the essence of its source. And there are others that are in this sort of environment of translation, like, for example, Coleman Barks, who was told by his mentor to free Rumi from the chains of the prose that was available. But why is it that in this transition of Maulana Rumi's, rahimahullah's words into the English language, there is a complete eradication of his orthodox beliefs? No mention of the Quran, the Sunnah, and other things that he speaks so deeply of and is so intertwined in his writings. What does that mean for how it is interpreted for others? What do we do of a disservice to share from our greatest treasures of the writings of the heart of someone like Maulana Rumi when it's shared with the West, but it's devoid of the reality and of the source from which those writings emanate from, which is the Quran and Sunnah? And here would be an example of how in the literary world there is this incredible work that is being done to desanitize writings that come from the East of their Islamic roots, to make it something, quote unquote, more accessible and palatable to people of the West. And so this as a genre is something that needs to be studied. And those people that are in the field of literature, translation, etc., these are elements of propaganda and elements of manipulation that one has to be very careful of. And not only is it in the works of Maulana Rumi rahimahullah, but even in the translation of even modern works. And what we see of the interjection of foreign beliefs into some Islamic textual writing. For example, within even the study Quran, what we find of the articles about perennialism, Tasawi al-Adyan, that all the deens are equal, all of that calling really to perdition, when the line that we follow is that of Islam, the line of salvation. And finally, to conclude, to read a little bit from this article. It's called The Tech Industry's War on Kids: How Psychology is Being Used as a Weapon Against Children. If I could, I would probably wish to read the whole article in its entirety. But the article begins essentially with a story of the author, who is a psychologist, who receives a young woman in his care. And this young girl, I believe she's a 15-year-old, she was basically, let me read this beginning because I think perhaps it'll help set the stage. We called the police because she wrecked her room and hit her mom, all because we took her phone, Kelly's father explained. He said that when the police arrived that evening, Kelly was distraught and told an officer that she wanted to kill herself. So an ambulance was called and the 15-year-old was strapped to a gurney, taken to a psychiatric hospital and monitored for safety before being released. Days after being hospitalized, Kelly was brought to my office by her parents who wanted to get her help for their troubled girl. Kelly's parents spoke first. They said their daughter's hospitalization was the culmination of a year-long downward spiral spurred by phone obsession. Kelly had been refusing to spend time with her family or focus on school. Instead, she favored living her life on social media. A previously happy girl and strong student, Kelly had grown angry, sullen, and was now bringing home report cards with sinking grades. Kelly's parents had tried many times in prior months to set limits in their daughter's phone use, but she had become increasingly defiant and deceitful, even sneaking on her phone at all hours of the night. I asked Kelly, who was sitting in a corner, to help me understand her perspective on that evening where the police were called. She didn't respond, and she instead glared at her parents. But then, surprising everyone in the room, she cried, "They took my phone." Attempting to engage Kelly in conversation, I asked her what she liked about her phone and social media. "They make me happy," she replied. And so then the author goes on to speak about how the undoing of families is becoming a product of the modern obsession with kids, with social media, and with their phones, and how it's leading children on really this dramatically destructive path of spending inordinate amount of times on phones. And he mentions gaming and spending time in the virtual world, such that it is completely dismantling what would be considered to be a normal human adolescent teen behavior. And then he quotes and he starts to speak about all of the efforts that are taking place in the world today and in technology centers and in universities across the world that are just obsessed with making these machines more addictive. He writes, nestled in an unremarkable building on the Stanford University campus in Palo Alto, California, is the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab, founded in 1998. The lab's creator, Dr. B.J. Fogg, a psychologist and the father of persuasive technology, a discipline in which digital machines and apps, including smartphones, social media, and video games, are configured to alter human thoughts and behaviors. As the lab's website boldly proclaims, machines designed to change humans. And so he writes, kids spend countless hours in social media and video game environments in pursuits of likes, friends, gain points, and levels because it's stimulating. They believe this makes them happy and successful, and they find it easier than doing the difficult but developmentally important activities of childhood. While persuasion techniques work well on adults, they are particularly effective on influencing the still maturing child and teen brain. Video games, better than anything else in our culture, deliver rewards to people, especially boys, says Fogg. Teenage boys are wired to seek competency, to master our world and get better at stuff. Video games, in dishing out rewards, can convey to people that their competency is growing. You get better at something second by second, and it's persuasive design that helps convince this generation of boys that they are gaining competency by spending countless hours on game sites, when in sad reality is that they are locked away in their rooms, gaming, ignoring school, and not developing real-world competencies like colleagues and employers demand. The Huffington Post article, What Really Happens on a Teenage iPhone, describes the life of 14-year-old Casey from Millburn, New Jersey, with 580 friends on Instagram and 1,110 on Facebook. She's preoccupied with the number of likes her Facebook profile picture receives compared to her peers. As she says, if you don't get 100 likes, you make other people share it so you get 100, or else you just get upset. Everyone wants to get the most likes. It's like a popularity contest. Article author Bianca Bosker says that there are costs to Casey's phone obsession, noting that the girl's phone, be it Facebook, Instagram, and iMessage is constantly pulling her away from her homework. Casey says she wishes she could put her phone down, but she can't. I'll wake up in the morning and go on Facebook just because, she says. It's not like I want to or I don't, I just go on it. I'm like forced to. I don't know why. I need to. Facebook takes up my whole life. Fogg is quoted in a cautionary in the Forbes article. Facebook, Twitter, Google, you name it. These companies have been using computers to influence our behavior. However, the driving force behind behavior change isn't computers. The missing link isn't the technology, it's psychology, says Fogg. Fogg says that potential users need to be triggered to use a site. This is accomplished by a myriad of digital tricks, including the sending of incessant notifications urging users to view friends' pictures, telling them they are missing out while they're on a social network, or suggesting that they check yet again to see if anyone liked their posts. And so the author writes, persuasive technologies work because of the apparent triggering of the release of dopamine, a powerful neurotransmitter involved in reward, attention, and addiction. In the Venice region of Los Angeles, now dubbed Silicon Beach, the startup Dopamine Labs boasts about its use of progressive techniques to increase profit. Quote, connect your app to our persuasive AI and lift your engagement and revenue up to 30% by giving your users our perfect bursts of dopamine. And a burst of dopamine doesn't just feel good, it's proven to rewire users' behaviors and brains. Ramsey Brown, the founder of Dopamine Labs, says in a KQED Science article, we have now developed a rigorous technology of the human mind, and that is both exciting and terrifying. We have the ability to twiddle some knobs in a machine learning dashboard we build, and around the world, hundreds of thousands of people are going to quietly change their behaviors in ways that, unbeknownst to them, feel second nature but are really by design. Programmers call this brain hacking, as it compels users to spend more and more time on sites, even though they mistakenly believe it's strictly due to their own conscious choices. Social networks and video games use the trusted brain manipulation technique of variable reward. Think slot machine. Users never know when they will get the next like or game reward, and it's delivered at the perfect time to foster maximal stimulation and keep them on the site. Banks of computers employ AI to learn which of the countless number of persuasive design elements will keep users hooked. A persuasion profile of a particular user's unique vulnerabilities is developed in real time and exploited to keep users on the site and make them return again and again for longer periods of time. This drives up profits and consumer internet companies whose revenues is based on how much these profits are used. The leaders of internet companies face an interesting, if almost morally questionable imperative. Either they hijack the neuroscience to gain market share and make large profits, or they let their competitors do it. It goes on. He speaks about not only technology like phones, like the idea of, for example, gaming. He speaks at length about, for example, Facebook, and how Facebook developed technology that they knew was definitively manipulating people's minds, changing the way they behave, and they just accepted it. He quotes video game developer John Hobson, who has a PhD in behavioral and brain science, wrote the paper Behavioral Game Design. He describes the use of design features to alter video game players' behavior, sounding much like an experiment running lab animals through their paces, answering questions like how to make players maintain a high consistent rate of activity and how to make players play forever. He says, this is not to say that players are the same as rats, but they are the general rules of learning equally apply to both. After he wrote his paper, he was hired at Microsoft. He worked at Microsoft's Xbox Live Labs. And essentially, his effect is still being felt, this technology. And so recently, something that happened to me is that I was also privy to some of the elements of game design, and it was an incredible, revealing notion just how much effort, how many people are hired in game development companies just for the sole purpose of making the game sticky, of making the game such that you just never want to leave it. So please forgive me for the length. I don't have time for Q&A. If you have questions after, please, I'm happy to try my best to answer them. Jazakumullah khairan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you, elevate you all, and make you all people of the luminous path of Islam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be people who truly and from the bottom of our heart recognize the beauty that is Deen and work our best to keep within this noble luminous path of Sirat al-Mustaqim, never to be taken away by Shaitan and his minions. May Allah help us to purify that which is inside of us, so that which is inside of us is clean, such that Shaitan, with his casting of his hooks and the hooks of his minions in all forms of propaganda, be they at the level of individual, family, or state, may we allow our hearts to be clean enough so that those hooks never catch. And may we always remember that the door to Allah is always open. And no matter where I am in a line, how close I am to the darkness that is the end of that line, before death I can turn to Allah, I can turn back and turn the gaze of my heart back to the luminosity of Islam. And if I walk that path with Allah's tawfiq, I will be re-enfolded in the light of guidance, the light of servitude, and the light of beauty. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us all always under that light. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.